Picture the year 1975. At that exact moment, Iran was holding 25,000 political prisoners. Per capita, that was the highest rate on earth. More than the brutal military juntas in Argentina, more than Pinochet's Chile, more than any other dictatorship of its time. And the wild thing is, this wasn't some backward, isolated regime. It was a Western-backed monarchy with a CIA-trained secret police that had turned torture into a standard bureaucratic routine. For 22 years, this agency, known as SAVAK, sent one clear, terrifying message to the Iranian people: step out of line and you disappear. Electric shocks, extracted fingernails, sexual violence, mock executions. These weren't random outbursts of cruelty, they were calculated methods heavily drawing on old Gestapo tactics. Except they were refined and modernized right inside the borders of a key U.S. ally. The Shah's prisons were packed. They held university professors, factory workers, and teenagers caught doing nothing more than handing out pamphlets. It all started on January 20th, 1957. When the Iranian Senate passed the bill that officially created SAVAK. Until 1979, it would operate as the regime's absolute weapon. But its architects, they weren't even Iranian. CIA officers and Mossad operatives trained the very first group of agents. They modeled the service directly on the FBI and the CIA. Washington wanted an unbreakable fortress against Soviet influence in the Persian Gulf, so they basically built one. At its peak in the 1970s, SAVAK employed about 5,000 full-time agents. Now, that might sound modest compared to East Germany's Stasi, which had hundreds of thousands of people on the payroll. But where the Stasi relied on mountains of paperwork and a massive informant network, SAVAK focused on raw, physical terror. A web of part-time collaborators reached into every university, factory, bazaar, and mosque. And the interrogation cells inside Tehran's notorious Evin and Comité prisons did the heavy lifting. 5,000 agents. An entire country silenced. The Iranian writer Reza Barahani actually survived this nightmare. In 1976, he published a devastating account of his time inside. He estimated that during SAVAK's first 19 years, more than 300,000 people cycled through Iranian prisons. Think about that for a second. That is roughly 1,500 arrests every single month, decade after decade. When Western journalists pressed the Shah on this in 1974, he shrugged it off, conceding there were maybe 3,400 to 3,500 political prisoners. At the exact same time, pro-regime lawyers and academics claimed the real number was as low as 100 or 150. How do you get a gap that massive? It was pure semantic warfare. SAVAK simply classified labor organizers, poets, students with the wrong book, and clerics with the wrong sermon as terrorists. And just like that, they didn't count toward the statistics. Years later, a 1974 U.S. Embassy telegram was declassified. It recorded, very dryly, very procedurally, that about 100 terrorists had been executed after judicial proceedings since 1968. It read like clean paperwork. But that same document hid something else. It noted that roughly 30 armed opponents were killed while resisting arrest in gun battles during just a single 7-month stretch of 1974. If you extrapolate that, this one category alone produced far more bodies per year than the official execution count. The American diplomats typing up those cables in Tehran knew exactly what was happening. They filed the reports, closed the cabinets, and went to the next embassy cocktail reception. Meanwhile, the arrests kept coming, the cells kept filling, and the numbers kept climbing. Behind all this lay an engineered system. This wasn't the improvised cruelty of sadistic guards. It followed strict protocols, training rotations, and escalation ladders. Prisoners were first kept in solitary confinement and deprived of the sleep for days. Once their psyche was fractured, they were introduced to the machinery. This included the Apollo, a metal bed frame wired for electric shocks, pliers for nails and teeth, burning cigarettes, and systematic rape used against both women and men. Mock executions came at the very end, designed to shatter whatever was left of the prisoner's mind. The goal was never just information. It was the total destruction of a person's identity. It was a message to everyone else. A lot of people didn't survive. Testimonies from 1976 document cases where detainees were tortured to death and their mutilated bodies were just handed back to their families without a single explanation or death certificate. Sometimes they were just dumped on the street outside their homes. Mothers were banned from holding public funerals. Lawyers who asked questions were thrown into cells themselves. This was state-sponsored repression as a business model. Planned, budgeted, and staffed with psychologists who literally advised interrogators on how to break specific personality types. SAVAK wasn't a rogue mob. It was a ministry. And every foreign government that trained its officers, sold it equipment, or shared intelligence knew exactly what happened behind those closed doors in Tehran. The training facilities operated completely in the open. They were even documented in Western budget reports. Washington knew, London knew, Tel Aviv knew. In diplomatic cables from the early 1970s, American officials openly acknowledged SAVAK's widespread torture and political imprisonment. The phrase appears almost in passing, sandwiched right between trade figures and oil contracts. But U.S. military and intelligence cooperation never slowed down. It actually accelerated. F-14 Tomcats were sold to Tehran, and CIA liaison officers shared critical intelligence. Anti-communist priorities trumped human rights. So, the lights in the torture chambers stayed on. Historians have since shown that SAVAK's methods were almost the exact blueprint for what the military dictatorships in Argentina and Chile did during their dirty wars in the late 70s. The electric prods, the forced disappearances, the bureaucratized confessions, this was a transnational technology of repression passed around between regimes from Panama to Langley. There are reports that SAVAK officers actually trained alongside South American agents, using manuals translated between Spanish, Farsi, and English. When Iranian dissidents begged American congressmen to step in, they were told the issue was too sensitive. The Shah was an ally. The prisoners were not. By late 1978, the game was up. Millions of people filled the streets of Tehran, and the Shah lost his grip. In January 1979, the Prime Minister formally dissolved SAVAK in a desperate panic to save the monarchy. It didn't work. Weeks later, the Shah fled. Ayatollah Khomeini returned from exile, and the Islamic Revolution swept the old regime away. But the apparatus itself didn't die. The new government inherited the files, the buildings, and even some of the personnel. By 1984, the revolutionary committees and the Interim Intelligence Service were merged right back into the new Ministry of Intelligence. Historians now argue that the executions of political and religious dissidents after 1979, especially during the 1988 prison massacres, when thousands were killed in just a few weeks, far surpassed the Shah's entire 22-year total. The revolution against tyranny had simply built a more efficient machine. The exact same cells in Evin prison that once held the Shah's victims now held the enemies of the Islamic Republic. Today, the word SAVAK is still invoked by everyone in Iran. The current government uses its memory to justify its massive security state, while the opposition uses it as a benchmark to describe modern repression. The institution has been dead for half a century, but the name lives on, because the underlying system of state survival never actually stopped.